Okay, let's unpack this. What if I told you that right in the early days of Christianity, the sources mention many thousands of Jews who believe,
Wow.
or that medieval England actually had a state-funded home just for Jewish converts. And part of the funding came from attacks on the Jewish community itself.
That's quite a hook. And it really hints at the depth and maybe some unexpected things in the sources we're looking at today.
Exactly.
Our source material for this deep dive, it's a pretty rich stack. We've got historical accounts, biographical sketches, personal stories.
Spanning a long time, right?
Oh, yeah, from the very beginnings of Christianity, really, right up to the 19th century.
And our goal here, our mission, is basically to sift through all this, pull out the important insights, and really try to understand the history, the experiences of Jewish individuals who converted to Christianity.
Looking at their motivations, the challenges.
Yeah, what they faced. And maybe what their journeys can teach us about history, faith, identity, all that complexity.
Yeah.
We want to help you get really well informed on this, well, frankly, often overlooked bit of history.
And it's definitely complex, lots of remarkable personal stories in there, far from just one simple narrative.
So thinking about those earliest days, our sources kick off by referencing that line from Acts 1, verse 20. Many thousands of Jews there are which believe. And it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who were they?
It really does. You want more detail.
What were their stories? What did they, go through?
And the accounts from that specific time, well, the sources are a bit sparse on individual names and details beyond the really early figures we already know.
Sure.
But the fact that the sources start there, highlighting that verse, it really underlines that this wasn't just, a few scattered people. It was a significant group right from the start.
And even if the New Testament itself doesn't give us loads of later individual stories, the sources point to early writers who were looking back, like Hegesippus.
Hegesippus, yeah. He's crucial here. The sources describe him as a Palestinian Hebrew Christian.
Writing around 150 A.D.
That's right. Sometimes called the father of church history. And what's really insightful, according to these accounts, is the purpose behind his books, the Hypomnemata Pente.
Right.
His goal, apparently, was to show that the gospel had made real progress among Jews, specifically countering this idea that, none of the Jewish rulers had believed in Jesus.
So he was actively documenting Jewish engagement with Christianity back then.
Exactly, despite the opposition.
And that opposition.
Yeah.
The sources suggest it wasn't just like informal disagreement, was it?
No, not at all. One really stark piece of evidence the sources bring up is the blessing against the heretics.
The Birkat Hammanim.
Precisely. Composed by Samuel the Little in the synagogue of Yabne, this prayer became part of the Jewish liturgy. And figures like Justin Martyr, Origen, Jerome, they complained about it. They saw it as specifically targeting Jewish Christians.
So it formalized the separation.
That seems to be the key insight here, yes. Early on, the split wasn't just theological. It led to actual formalized condemnation within the community structure itself. Daily prayer, even.
Wow. Creates a very real social divide.
Definitely. And yet, the sources also give hints of, unexpected intellectual interaction, like that odd little story about Rabbi Eliezer.
Oh, that one's fascinating. Tell us about that.
So the anecdote goes, Rabbi Eliezer hears an interpretation of a passage from Deuteronomy, from Jacob of Kfar Sakanya, an interpretation that Jacob said came from Jesus.
Okay.
And the sources say Eliezer was actually pleased with this interpretation, which apparently derived from the prophet Micah.
He liked Jesus' take on it.
Seemingly, yes. But the really surprising part is that this pleasure led others to suspect him of having Christian leanings. So what the sources suggest this reveals is that even at a high level of Jewish scholarship, Jesus' teachings were known, maybe even intellectually appreciated sometimes, suggests, maybe the boundaries weren't totally solid, at least in terms of ideas floating around.
And the sources even suggest this interaction might have had a ripple effect.
Yeah, they kind of speculate on that. The idea is floated that maybe some beautiful sayings found later in the Talmud, specifically in the Gemara period, things that sound quite similar to New Testament passages, might actually trace back to the influence of Hebrew Christians, like this Jacob, interacting with leading rabbis. So despite the formal split, there might have been this surprising level of intellectual cross-pollination influencing Jewish thought. At least that's what these accounts propose.
Interesting. Okay, so moving forward a bit, through the centuries, before we get to the really detailed biographies later on, the sources give us some glimpses, right? Medieval times, pre-Reformation.
Yes, scattered mentions. The sources talk about missionary efforts, particularly from the Roman Church, directed towards Jews in the pre-Reformation period.
Anything specific stand out?
Well, there's a mention of a missionary seminary set up in Spain, and the interesting detail is that people there specifically studied Hebrew literature for disputation, to engage Jews using Jewish texts. It shows this organized intellectual approach to conversion efforts back then, though the source does add a slightly critical note, saying it wasn't always according to knowledge.
And alongside these organized efforts, you get these legends popping up too.
Absolutely. The legend of Pope Elhanan is included in the sources.
The rabbi's son.
Yeah, the story goes he was kidnapped, raised Christian, somehow becomes pope, and then his Jewish origins are revealed. Probably not historical fact, right?
Likely not.
But the fact that such a dramatic story was circulating, it tells you something about how people were thinking about Jewish conversion, how it was perceived, maybe even mythologized.
The sources also mention figures from this general period who had connections, even if they weren't direct converts themselves.
Right, like Gregory Bar Hebraeus, prominent 13th century Syrian historian, scholar.
And his connection.
He was the son of a convert, which shows the impact wasn't just on the individual. It affected families, produced figures who contributed to the wider culture, even if, interestingly, the source notes Bar Hebraeus himself didn't know Hebrew.
And thinking about how institutions responded, that English example really stands out in the sources, the Domus Conversorum.
Ah, yes, that's a very concrete example. Henry III established it in 1232.
A dedicated home.
Exactly, a home for converts from Judaism, funded by the royal treasury, bishops' bequests. But here's the really striking detail, the unsettling part.
The tax.
The shivaj, a small poll tax levied on all Jews over 12. And the money explicitly went to help support this home for converts.
Wow.
So conversion wasn't just personal. It triggered state and religious mechanisms. And the Jewish community itself was effectively forced to help pay for individuals leaving it. The source does note only about 100 people benefited before the expulsion, so it wasn't a huge number, but the system itself. That's the insight.
That shivaj tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a stark detail. Paints a very clear picture of the pressures involved.
It really does.
Okay, so let's shift gears. Moving into the later centuries, say 15th through the 19th, this seems to be where the sources really open up with more personal stories, right? Detailed biographies.
Exactly. This is where we start to see the individuals much more clearly. And I think the first thing that really hits you from these accounts is just the sheer variety.
Variety of people.
Absolutely. Different backgrounds, different levels of Jewish learning, just all sorts.
So you had like prominent scholars, intellectuals.
Definitely. The sources mention people like Peter Ferris, a poet back in the 15th century. Hortensius Forti wrote a Hebrew grammar. Paulus Riccio, involved in physical science. Adolf Lassen, philosophy professor.
Neander, too, right? The famous theologian.
Yes, Neander, fighting rationalism. And then there's Shereshevsky, came from a rabbinic background, becomes an Anglican bishop, translates the Old Testament into Mandarin. Just incredible. And C. Theophilus Lucky, noted for profound scholarship.
And some were actually rabbis before they converted.
Yes, the sources point that out specifically. Figures like Nachman ben Samuel Halevi, who was involved in disputations, Wilhelm Isaac Bach, who ended up teaching Hebrew and writing a Christian catechism, C.W.H. Pauli, another rabbi and author.
So it wasn't just people on the fringes.
Not at all. The insight is that conversion happened even within the ranks of established Jewish religious leadership and scholarship.
And then others came from totally different walks of life.
Right. You get Lorenzo da Ponte Mozart's librettist, later became a professor, Guglielmo de Franchi, who spent his life promoting Hebrew knowledge among Christians, Dr. Leone Levi, a major economist and jurist in England, Adolf Bernard Marx, a well-known musician and composer.
Medical missionaries, too.
Yes, like Gabriel Benoli and Alexander Iliewitz. So the takeaway is clear. Conversion wasn't limited to one type of person or profession. It touched people all across the social spectrum.
So with all that diversity, how did they actually arrive at their new beliefs? The sources seem to show several common paths.
Yeah, a few themes really stand out across these biographies, and one huge one is Scripture.
Reading the Bible.
Reading the New Testament, often comparing it with the Old Testament. So many accounts emphasize this.
Like Bromet, reading Isaiah 53.
Exactly. Bromet says he read that chapter and suddenly saw Christ in it. Navorsky describes reading the New Testament day and night. Rosenstrach talks about seeing the glory of him who said, "I am the light of the world," in the Bible. Jacobson was told by a Christian, "Go compare the prophecies," and that led him.
So a very personal text-driven thing for many.
It seems so. The insight is that deep personal engagement with the religious texts themselves was often the driving force.
But it wasn't always just them alone with a book, was it? Interactions with Christians seem important too.
Definitely. Relationships, conversations. They were often crucial catalysts. Jabesh meets a Scotchman who gives him a New Testament. That starts him off. Max Rosenstrach's journey involved meeting a Mr. Trubich. Biesenthal lived with a Christian family, saw their life, and it changed his perspective. Joel encountered missionaries.
So personal connections mattered.
Yeah, the insight seems to be that personal connection. Seeing Christianity lived out often went hand in hand with the reading and study.
These accounts also often describe a lot of internal struggle, right?
Yeah.
Not just a smooth, easy shift.
Oh, the sources are very clear about that. Many went through real personal turmoil. Rosenstrach mentions an unspeakable struggle. Bromet describes acute distress of mind, feeling lost, praying extempore for the first time out of sheer desperation.
Neander, too.
Neander's journey from rationalism to faith was apparently a huge intellectual and spiritual battle. Navorsky had restless nights wrestling with it all. So yeah, the sources really highlight that conversion was often a deeply challenging internal process, not something taken lightly at all.
And sometimes a really specific dramatic event could be the turning point.
Yes, there are some powerful anecdotes like that. Goldberg, sheltering from a storm, picks one tree stump and lightning hits the one next to it. He felt Providence saved him, and that pushed him spiritually. Or Dr. Lazaron, the death of his own child spurred him to found a school and asylum for poor children, dedicating his life to service in that way. So while theology was key, these deeply personal life events also played a big role for some.
Given everything we've discussed, the Birkat Hamenim, that Shivaj taxed these journeys clearly weren't easy. The sources really detail the opposition and suffering these people face.
Oh, the challenges were immense, often heartbreaking. Family and community opposition seems almost universal in these accounts and deeply painful.
Any examples jump out?
Well, Ben Zion's father actually lost his job just because his son was reading Mendelssohn's German Bible translation, which was a stepping stone for Ben Zion. Rosenstrach's wife initially refused to join him. Shapiro's father saw his son becoming a Christian missionary as a huge disgrace.
That must have been incredibly difficult.
Bromet suffered in silence because of his situation. Jacobson talks about being physically disciplined by his father for his interest in Christianity. The key insight is just the profound personal loss and alienation conversion often meant. Losing your closest relationships, your community.
And sometimes it went beyond social pressure to actual physical harm.
Yes, the sources document imprisonment, physical abuse. Jacob Levi imprisoned 10 times, even subjected to the bastonado, a severe beating.
10 times.
Yet the sources say he remained unwavering. Ben Zion was locked up and beaten by his teacher just for drawing a cross. It shows the real hostility some encountered.
And economically, too, there were consequences.
Frequently, loss of property, like Goldberg experienced, people had to abandon their old livelihoods, find new ways to survive. Navorsky, from a farming background, had to learn bookbinding. Posner's family reaction affected his inheritance. Ben Zion was left destitute, wandering. The sources make it clear the decision often came with severe practical financial costs.
It's kind of remarkable, though. Despite all that separation and persecution, some converts still felt connected to the Jewish community, even defended it.
That's a really crucial, maybe counterintuitive point highlighted in the sources. There's mention of this protest of Christian Jews in England.
What were they protesting?
The blood accusation, that horrific false charge about Jews using Christian blood. And this protest was signed by converts who had grown up Jewish.
So even after converting, facing rejection.
They maintained a solidarity, yeah. They actively defended the Jewish community against those vile slanders. It's a powerful insight into the complexity of their identity.
So after navigating these tough paths, facing all these challenges, what did they do? What impact did they have, according to the sources?
Well, their contributions were pretty significant across different areas, but a really strong theme is this dedication to sharing their new faith, often specifically with other Jewish people.
Becoming missionaries themselves.
Exactly. Loads of them became missionaries, felt a real calling to reach out to Jewish communities. The sources mention work in Jerusalem, London, Amsterdam, Damascus, even China, Abyssinia.
Working with specific groups.
Often, yeah. Organizations like the London Society for Promoting Christianity, amongst the Jews, the LJS, the British Society, Mildmay Mission, Scotch Mission. Figures like Ewald are noted for bringing apparently 40 Jewish families to faith in London. Pauli made a strong impression in Berlin and Amsterdam. Shapiro actually pioneered Jewish mission work in Brooklyn.
So their own experience often fueled that work.
It really seems that way. Their journey often led to a desire to see others from their background explore similar paths.
And some rose to pretty high positions within the Christian church.
Yes, the sources highlight people like Bishop Alexander, first Anglican bishop in Jerusalem, described as genuinely beloved by converts and deeply connected to his heritage.
And Bishop Scherchesky.
Right. From a rabbinic background, becomes a missionary bishop in China. That monumental Old Testament translation into Mandarin. Others became pastors, clergy, reorganizing parishes like Reverend G. Handel.
Their impact wasn't just in religious roles, though, was it? Scholarship, writing?
Oh, absolutely. Huge contributions there. The sources detail converts producing important works. Christiani translated the New Testament into Hebrew, wrote critiques of the Talmud from his new perspective. Neander's theological works were massively influential. Picsau lectured widely on Hebrew topics, wrote books like The Gospels from the Rabbinical Point of View, Bridging His Knowledge. Rosenthal created prayer books and catechisms specifically for Jewish inquirers.
So using their unique background.
Exactly. Grammars, dictionaries, commentaries, they really enriched the intellectual resources, drawing from their dual heritage. It's a key insight. Their ability to operate in both worlds led to new kinds of scholarly and religious work.
And some had a broader social impact, too, beyond the church or academia.
Yes. Dr. Lazaron, we mentioned, founded that school and asylum for poor children after his personal tragedy. Dr. Leonie Levi, major contributions in economics and law. Adolf Bernard Marx, the composer and music theorist. So, yeah, the contributions were diverse, reaching into many aspects of culture and professional life.
So looking across all these stories, all these centuries, diverse people, what are the big themes, the patterns that keep coming up in the sources?
Well, first, I think just the fact that there were Jewish individuals embracing Christianity throughout history, it persisted even if numbers varied, that's clear.
Okay.
Second, as we saw, the sources really emphasized the incredible variety of their experiences. No single path, no single reason.
Right.
And third, pretty consistently across many accounts, is that central role of Scripture. Engaging with the texts, comparing Old and New Testaments, that really stands out as a powerful catalyst.
That does seem to tie a lot of the personal stories together. And what about that tricky idea of identity? How did they see themselves? Did the sources touch on that?
They do, yeah. And it's fascinating. Some figures, like Shapiro and Stern, are quoted expressing this idea that while they were Christian by grace, they still felt Jewish. Jewish by nature, by race, by sympathy.
So not erasing their Jewishness.
Exactly. The insight seems to be that for some, conversion wasn't about becoming not Jewish. It was more like adding a layer, holding their ethnic, cultural heritage alongside their new religious faith. It really makes you think about how complex identity is, especially when core beliefs change.
This has been, well, quite a deep dive into these sources. We've gone from those early mentions in Acts through medieval times, right into these really detailed personal journeys from the 15th and 19th centuries.
Seeing their diverse origins, the huge challenges they faced, and the contributions they ended up making in so many different fields.
Yeah, exploring these specific accounts, these details, it gives you a much richer, more human understanding than just a general overview ever could. Really brings it to life.
It really does.
So, as you think about all these stories we've explored today, considering how deeply personal these journeys were, how costly they often were losing family, facing hardship, that intense internal struggle, economic loss. What does that tell us about the power of conviction, and maybe about the complex, layered ways people have always had to navigate identity, belief, and community throughout history? Something to ponder until our next deep dive.